everyone, this is my second video in 2 days. You're getting a double dose of me, and there'll be more videos lined up this weekend, so you are gonna get sick of me by the end of this week, so. But this video is this week's review of the corresponding episode of Dark Side of the Ring. This week's episode on Vice TV was about the Road Warriors, the rise and fall, and the unfortunate passing of Hawk. I guess I'll start off by talking about my personal feelings on the Road Warriors, and basically how I feel about them is they're the Road Warriors, the Legion of Doom, Hawk and Animal, the two biggest badass motherfuckers to ever form a tag team. With the face paint, the shoulder pads, the spikes, the music, everything about them, even the hair, which they talked about. They're one of the coolest tag teams in the history of professional wrestling, and just two badass guys that beat the shit out of people, and what's not to like about that? And they're one of those teams where they were so cool that the idea of running with them as heels just sounds completely alien to me. It's like, how in the world could those guys ever be heels? They're too cool. They're way too cool to not be baby faces. Just the coolest baby faces on the planet. So I love the Road Warriors. As someone who's a big fan of tag team wrestling and a big fan of that era of tag team wrestling, that mid 80s to early 90s, that period, the Road Warriors is one of, if not the greatest team to come out of that era. And, you know, you look at them and they were kind of like the Hulk Hogan of tag team wrestling in a sense, where they were just the pillars of the whole art form of tag team wrestling. I would even make another comparison to Goldberg. In '98, Goldberg did for singles wrestling what the Road Warriors did for tag team wrestling, where they were just big, badass motherfuckers that beat the shit out of people. And that's all anybody ever wanted them to do. Not saying that they couldn't work a match. They could. You put them in there with the Four Horsemen or the Midnight Express, and their battles with the Russians, the Kolovs. And those Russian chain matches they had were just brutal. They could work, but it was typically better to put them in squash matches because that's how they got over. They got over by just mauling people and running through people, and they were so much fun to watch. So that's my feeling on the Road Warriors. Now, how did I feel about this episode? Unfortunately, I think it's probably the weakest episode that they've done thus far. With Dark Side of the Ring, and the main reason for that is that it didn't really cover any new ground that we didn't already know, that most wrestling fans didn't already know. I assume if you know nothing about the Road Warriors or anything about the history of wrestling, watching something like this might pique your interest. It's, and I often forget, I kind of review these documentaries from the point of view of someone like me who already knows a lot about the professional wrestling business, but to somebody who's a complete novice and doesn't know anything, something about one of the greatest tag teams in the history of the business is very beneficial to people like that. But for me, there was hardly anything in the documentary that I didn't already know. Even the little things like them talking about the hair and the evolution of the Road Warriors look, I'm pretty sure all of that was covered in the WWE DVD that was released. I want to say mid to late 2000s, somewhere in that range. This episode didn't really cover anything I didn't already know, and it didn't do what, say, the Dr. D. David Schultz episode did, which took something that everybody knew about and found a way to kind of work it into this larger narrative of the death of kayfabe, and took that really interesting spin. I'm like, okay, that was an interesting take on something that we already knew, but we didn't really think about it in like the more grand scale and how important that event was leading towards the death of kayfabe. But with the Road Warriors, it was pretty much just the history of the Road Warriors with all of Hawk's problems in the 90s and the trials and tribulations along with that. Kind of being a main focal point of the dark side element of that these episodes are expected to have. And the Hawk story was tragic. I was very upset when he passed. When you're as big a fan of the Road Warriors as I am and find out one of them passes away, it's very sad. And it was nice to know that Hawk cleaned his life up prior to his passing, and he got himself on track and made a better life for himself. But I knew about some of the hard times that the Road Warriors went through. They even made an angle out of it on TV, which I thought was an extremely poor taste. But that was that era. That was the Attitude Era, where they would try to take things that are real and make a story out of it, or try to go as far as they could possibly go just to see what works. It was around the same time, I think, right before this, they did the Terry Runnels miscarriage angle, which is, ask Jim Cornette about that, he'll flip out. But yeah, so I wasn't a huge fan of that. I'm a little surprised they didn't bring up Rocco, the ventriloquist dummy, which to this day is still one of the most baffling creative decisions I've ever seen. Even as a kid, I was like, why did they put the Legion of Doom with a ventriloquist dummy? The two just don't go. I don't understand it. And, some might speculate that Vince did it on purpose to rib him, kind of like what happened to Dusty, but I kind of feel like, dude, I could totally see Vince being on board with that idea and just legitimately liking it. I could see Vince liking it. He would think it's funny. To him, the contrast is what makes it hilarious, but he doesn't realize it completely goes against the image of the Road Warriors. But yeah, but going through this thing, it was cool that they got, we had Animal, we had Paul Ellering, Scott Norton was on it, which that was pretty cool to see. Hadn't seen him in a while, and I've been watching all these old Nitros, and I'm like, man, what happened to Scott Norton? I haven't seen him in a while. There's another dude, I would not fuck with him in any real fight scenario. I'm like, no, dude, you win whatever, dude, I'm not crossing your path. So it was cool to see Scott. It was cool to see Draws used again and The Godfather. I was a little surprised that Jim Cornette didn't factor into it, especially since one of the few matches that got talked about on this thing, because that was another element of this I didn't really care for. It was extremely rushed. They didn't spend a whole lot of time on the career of the Road Warriors and the various programs they had at different territories. They didn't talk too much about the AWA and what they did there. They didn't talk very much about, they talked a little bit about their battles with Nikita Koloff and Barry Darsow, the Russians, both of which who were interviewed as part of it, which that was cool to see. I like Barry Darsow a lot because I'm a big Demolition fan too. So whenever I see him, I kind of mark out a little bit. So, and they talked about the scaffold match, the Skywalker match at Starrcade with the Midnight Express. I was a little surprised that they didn't have Cornette be more of a presence on that. But again, so much of it was very, very rushed because they were basically condensing 30 years down into 42 minutes or whatever. And when you do that, certain things are going to get skipped over. They didn't mention that. I mean, they made their WWF run sound like a complete and utter failure. And I'm like, dude, they did win the tag titles. It's not like they didn't get the straps. They had their moments in the WWF. It was their, probably the least amount of success that they had, given, how they did everywhere else they went. But they did get the belts in the WWF, so it wasn't like they were complete and utter failures. And they got massively over because, of course, they did. I mean, Jesus Christ. They didn't talk too much about LOD 2000. Would have been nice to have Sunny on there just to talk about that, even though their run with her wasn't very long. That is, personal opinion, that's the hottest that Sunny ever looked. With that outfit, I am shocked she didn't have wardrobe malfunctions all the time with that wearing that top. But but again, going over the entire documentary, there are a couple little things that were neat. It was kind of interesting that they worked in a He-Man clip into a wrestling documentary, although Paul Ellering said that the Legion of Doom came from He-Man. Technically not correct. It came from the Super Friends, which I believe was also mentioned on the WWE DVD. Meanwhile, at the Hall of Doom, the Legion of Doom fought the Super Friends, who was the cartoon version of the Justice League, for those of you who don't know, you youngins out there who don't know your DC cartoon history. Speaking of which, I've watched a shit ton of DC animated movies lately. I might make a video about that, so stay tuned for that. But so it was kind of neat to know that Hawk watched He-Man and watched Super Friends, and this again, Hawk, this legit tough badass motherfucker, watched the same cartoons that I was watching at that same time. That to me is super funny. I find that to be super, super funny that that Hawk would be watching the same cartoons that I watch. Maybe he did it as market research because, all right, what are the kids into these days? Maybe we can borrow from that. Because you look at the Legion of Doom, they look like they were straight out of a comic book or a movie or something like that. And they even admitted that they borrowed a lot from the movie The Road Warrior, that old Mad Max movie. Really good movie, by the way. I like the Mad Max movie. That's another thing I want to get. Don't get me started on this. Everybody says that Beyond Thunderdome is the worst one. I wholeheartedly disagree. Thunderdome is awesome, and I just want to make that point perfectly clear so you know my stance on Beyond Thunderdome. But yeah, this episode, I felt like I said, I felt like it didn't bring anything new to the table, and I think that's what it was kind of lacking. So if you don't know anything about the Road Warriors, I think this is a good introduction to them, even if it is kind of rushed. But for a better look at their career, you may want to check out the WWE DVD that they did. I believe the doc is on the network, if I'm not mistaken. But there are other places to get like a full rundown of the history of the Road Warriors and all of the problems with Hawk and everything. You don't necessarily... I think that maybe that's the biggest problem I had with this episode. This episode didn't really fill any void. It didn't cover any new areas. It's kind of like when they did the Montreal Screwjob, which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, was the first episode they ever did in season 1. And yeah, it's a big milestone moment in pro wrestling. If you don't cover it, it feels like you're missing something. But at the same time, I had seen that story talked about so many times in so many different shoot interviews that by the time I saw the Dark Side of the Ring, it was like everything was regurgitated to me. I already knew everything that was in that. So take that for what it's worth. So yeah, this was probably the weakest episode of season 2, and that's no disrespect to Hawk or Animal at all. I've seen their story covered in better areas, and but again, if you don't know anything about them, which if you're a wrestling fan, I don't know how you don't know anything about the Road Warriors. This episode was a decent like starting point to kind of like get an idea of who they were, but there's a lot more material out there with the Road Warriors to go look at. And, you know, if you go out there mining for Road Warriors material, you're going to have fun because, like I said, they're one of the coolest fucking tag teams of all time. One of my personal favorites. So that concludes my thoughts on this episode. I didn't really have a whole heck of a lot to say about it because, like I said, I felt like it didn't cover anything new. But it's a well-produced piece of work, as you would expect from this series. And next week will be my last video on Dark Side of the Ring because it's the season finale. It'll be about Owen Hart, and that one I am very interested in seeing because that one, there's so many conflicting viewpoints on what happened and what happened in the fallout, what continues to go on to this day with Martha Hart and Owen's family. And I've said it on this video. I've made my feelings perfectly clear about Owen going into the Hall of Fame, but I'll save it for next week's video. But I'm very interested in seeing how they approach that whole subject, especially since a lot of WWE footage has been used this season, and they didn't always paint the WWE in the best light. So I'm very curious to see how they present everything. And it should be very, very fascinating. Also emotionally draining. I also expect to shed a few tears while this is going on. So those are my thoughts on this week's episode. I'll be back next week with another one. I've got other videos lined up for you along the way, so stay tuned for those. But that is all I have for you right now. Thanks again, everybody, for watching, and I will see you later.